curiosity,
critical thinking,
optimization,
passion,
inclusion, sustainability.
That's what Research Matters is about.
What matters now is creating new materials that can impact everyday life.
What matters now is connectivity.
The economy and the environment.
Technology. What matters now is public education.
global impact, understanding our place in the universe.
freshwater resources,
food security,
Better data.
brain potential, health,
Energy, digital literacy,
Safer food and water.
culture, environment, and health.
I believe that what matters now is to learn how to live sustainably.
Hello, everybody. Nice to have a crowded room tonight. Thank you all for coming out to Research Matters, What Matters Now. My name is Pia Chattopadhyay. I'm a broadcaster based in Toronto. On many days, you can hear me on CBC Radio, hosting programs including The Current, Toronto's Morning Show, Metro Morning, as well as The World at 6. On other days, you can watch me on TVO as I fill in for Steve Paikin on The Agenda. I'm also the summer host of that program. It is good to be in London. I was telling my 3-year-old that I was coming to London. And she said, wow, Mama, London. And I said, well, it's not that London. She said, wow, Mama, London. So I feel that I'm in London, whatever London it is. It's wonderful to be here. So thank you for having us. I want to just extend an extra warm welcome to two people that we have with us tonight. Gary Libin, who's the Vice President of Research at Brock. Gary, are you here? Where are you? There he is in the back. Hello to you. And also to Donna Katsopoulos, a researcher from Wilfrid Laurier, who was part of Research Matters last year. Donna, where are you? Give us a little wave there. There she is. Hi, Donna. Last year, Donna focused on the question with her fellow researchers about life in 2030. This year, we are focusing on something more immediate. What matters now? And it is a good question. What matters now? As you saw in that video, there are lots of ways to answer it. It's also a topic that we seem to rarely focus on these days. We always seem to be talking about the future and what might be and what might happen and what all the implications are. It is very important to be, living in the present, talking about the present and what matters now. So tonight we're going to hear 5 different answers to that question. You will also have a chance to answer that question for yourself. But before we get to that, I need to tell you a couple more things about tonight's event. This is one of 5 discussions happening around our province. We were in Hamilton a couple of weeks ago, and in the new year, we're going to Thunder Bay, Kingston, and the GTA. These events are part of a project known as Research Matters, and every publicly assisted university in Ontario is involved through events, stories on our website, conversations with the media, and a lot of other activities. Research Matters is really about connecting Ontarians with university researchers and connecting university research to the everyday ways we live, work, and play. And we say play because you'll see tonight and through our other series that researchers focus on a lot of different things. It's as varied as can be, and yes, some of it has to do with how we play. But most of us think of university research as something that is really locked behind the brick walls, that academia is something that lives and breathes only on campuses. And in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. The researchers that you're going to hear from tonight and those in the other events in this series focus on issues like safe food and water, strong communities, sustainable living, and economic competitiveness. So things that affect each and every one of us each and every day. If you're concerned about an issue, and really any issue, it's pretty assured that someone at an Ontario university is studying it. And Research Matters is really about giving you access. Your taxes help fund the work that our speakers you'll hear from tonight do. And so you deserve to hear about what they're learning and about what you can learn from them. So we hope you'll find it interesting. We hope you will find it useful. And we hope that tonight's event will inspire you to take pride, perhaps a new pride, in the world-leading research that's happening right here in London and across our great province. So we have 5 researchers tonight. Their presentations will be short. Each researcher has about 7 minutes to make their case. I'll give them the hook shortly after that if they don't get down. Once you've heard from all 5 researchers, you will have a chance to ask them questions. We'll be taking questions via Twitter. Our hashtag is #WhatMattersNow. From people who are watching this event live via webcast, a special shout out to the students at Brock who have gathered in a pub to watch this event. So I don't know if they're going to make a drinking game out of this or what, but anyway, hello students at Brock's Pub. So before we get on with our first speaker, we want to ask you what you think about the topics you're going to hear about tonight. When you came in, you got a device. It's a little white clicker, looks like a keypad. It's an audience response device. Anyone not have a device that looks like this? There's a woman up here. Michelle's going to bring you in. Anyone else? We'll just get her just up here, Michelle, by the door. All right. So of the 5 subject areas that we're going to be talking about tonight, we want you to vote on which one really matters now. So let's bring them up. Okay, so if you think eradicating infectious disease is the most important thing about what matters now, you can punch in A or 1. B, how much of a threat are Canadian terrorists? C, how do we improve our borderline relationship with the US? D, how does the brain control the body? And E, how can we maintain mobility into old age? So I'll give you just a few seconds, just to lock in your answer. If you lock in the wrong one, you can do it again, and it will lock in your most recent answer. Everyone voted? Okay. We are not going to show you the results of that just yet. We're going to see them a little later on in the evening. Question for you guys. Anyone ever had the experience where when you're talking to someone, it feels like they know what you're thinking even before you know what you're thinking? Anyone ever had that experience? You're like, what's going on here? No one? Really? Come on. Guy in the back. He does. No one else has had that experience? You're talking to someone, you think, they know what I'm thinking, and I don't even know what I'm thinking. If you've never had that experience, I think you're odd, frankly. I think we've all had that experience. Jodie Cullum certainly knows that we have had that experience because this is what she does for a living. Jodie's a neuroscientist here at Western University, which means she has hometown advantage, and she's going to tell you more about exactly what she researches as she argues that what matters now is how the brain controls our body. Jodie.
So I'd like to begin by asking you a question, and perhaps we can get the first audience polling question up on the screen here. This is not the right question. Although you can think about this, I suspect this is going to come up a few talks from now. So. No? Nope. Yes. Yay. Okay, so this is the question that I want to ask you. If neuroscientists were able to read your mind, would you want them to? Press the 1 or A button if the answer is yes, and the 2 or B button if the answer is no. We'll just give you a moment to punch in your responses there. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you would say no in this case. We have, I guess these are raw numbers, we have 20 people who've said that yes, they would want neuroscientists to read their minds, 33 people saying that no, they wouldn't. And perhaps now we could go to the slides for my presentation. What I'm hoping to do today is to actually convince you, first of all, that there is some potential that one of the hot topics in neuroscience is this idea, not necessarily of mind reading, but what we'll call brain reading. And 2, that that's not necessarily a bad thing, that this has some potential uses that could be very valuable to our society. If I could get you to advance to the next slide. So what do I mean by brain reading? What I'm referring to here is the possibility that we can use signals from the brain to decode or determine, at least hazard a reasonable guess about what someone might be seeing, thinking, dreaming, or planning to do. We can go to the next slide, please. So one of the approaches that we can use to do this is something called functional MRI. So functional MRI is the same machine that is used when you go to the hospital to get an anatomical MRI scan, but there's an extra twist to it. And that twist is that the functional MRI images measure brain activation in terms of the amount of blood that is flowing to different localized areas. And we can measure this local blood flow in the brain in small areas of the brain. And we, in fact, sample the brain in these tiny little cubes, sort of like Lego pieces, that are about 3 millimeters in each direction. And in a typical experiment, we might be scanning about 100,000 of these little voxels, or volumetric pixels, every 2 seconds for several minutes at a time. And then we can look at how the blood flow changes as people are thinking about doing different things or actually doing different things. Next slide. The idea behind brain decoding is that we can look at the patterns of activation in some of these localized regions. So we might look, for example, in an area that's involved in object recognition. And we might show our subject in the brain scanner different pictures, say, for example, pictures of shoes and pictures of cats. This is a fairly arbitrarily chosen example, but it illustrates the point. So as we're showing them pictures of shoes and pictures of tools, we'll see different patterns, spatial patterns of brain activation in some of the areas that we're interested in. And you can see, if you look at those grids on the right-hand side, that there are different patterns when the person is looking at a shoe than when they're looking at a cat. And we can take those patterns and we can train a computer to learn the difference between when the person is looking at a shoe and when they're looking at a cat. Advance, please. We can then present the person with another stimulus and ask the computer, without telling the computer what happened on that trial, we can ask the computer to guess what the subject was most likely looking at for the mystery trial. And you might be able to tell just from looking at this that the pattern for the mystery stimulus looks more like the pattern for a shoe than the pattern for a cat. So if our computer algorithm was any good, it would say that the subject was more likely to be looking at more likely to be looking at a shoe than a cat in this case. Next slide, please. In my lab, we don't look at object recognition, but we're interested in looking at the areas of the brain that are active when people are planning to do actions or actually doing those actions. Next. Sorry, can you go back for a second? So I'll just point out here, the work in my lab, we use the usual fMRI scanner, but we do a few things differently than what most experiments do. We have the subject's head tilted so that they can look directly at the workspace of the hand. And then we can put different objects around the hand's workspace, or even things like tools, and we can have subjects perform different actions while they're directly looking at what the hands are doing. Next. So the main line of research that I want to describe today is some work where we've been looking to see if we can decode what action people are planning to do a few seconds later. And so we put the people in the scanner, they're looking at the table over their hips, there's an object on the table, and they're given an auditory instruction that tells them that they're to grasp the top part of the object, grasp the bottom part of the object, or reach out and touch the object. They wait until they hear a beep, and then they perform the action. And the critical thing is that we look at the brain activation patterns in those few seconds before they actually perform the action. And we're asking the question whether we can predict what they're going to do when the beep comes. And what we found from our research is that we can indeed predict better than chance which action the person is going to perform, which object they're going to perform it on, what the location of the object is, and even how they're going to act on the object. Are they going to move their eyes to it? Are they going to do something with the left hand or the right hand, or even use a tool? And we can predict, not perfectly, but certainly better than chance, all of these different aspects. So why is this an interesting question? Can we go to the next slide, please? Well, some of the implications of this work come from an approach called brain-machine interfaces. And this is based on some research that came out about a year ago from some researchers in Rhode Island. And what they were able to do was to take a grid of 96 electrodes, shown there in the upper right, and implant it into the top of the brain of a patient who's shown there. The patient had had a stroke 15 years previously, and she had lost the ability to move her arms and her legs. She was quadriplegic. And they implanted the electrode into her brain, and they were able to train a computer to read her brain signals in order to control a robotic limb. Now, if you could click play on the video, we can just watch what happens here. So she's got the electrodes. You can see the electrodes at the top of her brain. Those are being fed into a computer. That computer is processing the signals based on what it's learned from some earlier training trials. And she's now thinking about how she wants to move the robotic limb, and you can see she's able to do it pretty well. She's able to tilt the bottle and take a sip out of it. This is the first time this woman has been able to make an action in 15 years, and she's pretty happy about it. Next slide. So our research speaks to the question of where do we put the electrodes in the human brain? So we've seen one example of one brain area. You can see there's a lot of room for improvement. Our research allows us to test the human brain and to tell where to put those electrodes. We obviously don't want to be putting electrodes into people's brains without having some idea that there's going to be useful signals there. Next, please. Just to give you a flavor of some of the work that other labs are doing, different labs have been able to show that they can decode what a person is looking at in a movie, that they can decode what a person is dreaming about in an MRI scanner, that they can decode the words that people are thinking about. Next slide. Some of the other potential implications for this work are, first, that there might be some fun applications, things like neurotechnology or neurogaming. We're used to the idea of things like Microsoft Kinect, controlling systems with our body movements. What if we can control systems with our mind? What if we could control our computers with our mind? What if we could play games with our brains? And the other application, in addition to things like working with spinal cord patients and movement impaired patients like you've seen, is working with patients who might not be able to communicate otherwise. And I'm referring here to work, for example, by my colleague Adrian Owen, who is able to show that in vegetative patients who were thought not to have any conscious awareness, that they could actually use their brain signals in order to answer yes/no questions. So I'll stop with that, and I hope I've convinced you, one, that neuroscience is now, in the present day, moving towards the ability to read people's brains, and that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Last slide, and I'll just say thank you to my collaborators, to the funding agencies that sponsored this work, and to you for your attention. Thank you.
My mic on? Thanks, Jody. Caleb, can we get this on? Yeah. Got it there? Can you hear me? Hello? 1, 2. Thanks. One of the things that people really enjoy about this series is the variety of research and researchers that we hear from. I think a lot of us are probably a little fatigued about hearing all the news coming out of Toronto in terms of, Canada's biggest export lately seems to be about news about Toronto's mayor. So we're not going to be talking about the mayor at all tonight. Bill Anderson, our next speaker, in fact, doesn't study Rob Ford. He does, however, study Canada's trade relationship with our friends just across the river from his home university in Windsor. He studies our neighbors to the south, of course. There is much more, as we all know very well, to our trade relationship with the U.S., a relationship that is shaped as much by geography as it is by economics, and that's why it takes an economic geographer like Bill to argue that what matters now is connectivity, in particular with regard to our cross-border relationship with the United States. Bill.
See how this clicker works. Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. I want to talk about our research that we do on the Canada-U.S. border at the University of Windsor, but I want to put it into a larger context. I want to make the case that what matters now is connectivity. There we go. I'm an economic geographer, and economic geographers basically study the spatial distribution of economic activities, what happens where, and how people in different places interact economically with one another. So it's sometimes been called the science of spatial interaction. By spatial interaction, we mean the movement of goods, people, information, money from one place to another. And connectivity is necessary for that movement to take place. So connectivity is basic to economic development, and that's borders are one of the main impedances to connectivity. When we talk about connectivity, or we talk about spatial interaction, I had an old teacher that used to say that when we talk about spatial interaction, we're always talking about two different types of things. One is moving molecules, the other one is moving bits. Basically moving things versus moving information. And naturally, all of these movements require some sort of mechanism, some sort of vehicles, and it can extend from the largest vehicles in the world, these container ships, to something as small as a smartphone that provides connectivity for you for the entire globe. Interestingly, we're living in times when this clear distinction between the movement of molecules and the movement of bits is becoming somewhat blurred. For example, this picture on the bottom here is a picture of a turbine that was made by an additive manufacturing technology, or basically what's called 3D printing. And basically here, instead of making this item and shipping it to its final destination, you design it, you ship the information to the final destination, and you make it there. And so the movement of molecules and the movement of bits is becoming more complex and more interrelated. And the movement of bits through the atmosphere here. Oh, okay. Now, so connectivity is a great thing, but connectivity is also a thing that imposes a lot of costs. We all know that with greater connectivity in terms of trade, you can have things like industrial restructuring. When a lot of this connectivity is energy intensive, and consequently it has an impact on climate change. When people and goods move around the world, they carry with them diseases, invasive species, cyber crimes. You know, the internet has opened up new vistas of crime, extending from internet scams to sexual exploitation. One of the things we study at the University of Windsor is supply chain vulnerability. We saw in the year 2001 that we had 2 natural disasters on the other side of the world, a tsunami that took place in Japan and floods that took place in Thailand, that actually crippled supply chains for automotives and other types of economic production as far away as here in Ontario and in the United States. So connectivity has its benefits, but it also has its costs. And some people might say, when you look at this list of things, well, maybe the best thing is to just sort of opt out of connectivity. But the truth of the matter is that you don't really have that choice. Connectivity is not something that's good or bad, but it's something that's reality. It reminds me of Jean Chrétien's famous comment about protectionism and globalization. He said, protectionism isn't right-wing or left-wing. Left-wing protectionism is passé. Globalization isn't right-wing or left-wing. Globalization is reality. Well, connectivity is reality, increasingly. So it's within this spirit, it's within this spirit of, it's within this spirit of looking at how connectivity works that my colleagues and I at the University of Windsor are looking at issues related to the Canada-US border. So this is what we're studying, the Canada-US border. Now, this isn't the whole border, but this is the part that connects Ontario to the rest of the United States. Now, the United States and Canada have the world's largest bilateral trade relationship, and about 50% of that takes place with Ontario. And consequently, 50% of that huge trade relationship goes through these Great Lakes crossings. And in fact, the 3 dots that you see there represents the great majority of all of that trade that goes through there. And so these are critical points of connectivity. But, however, they're not very smooth. They're not very smooth connections. These are pictures, I like to call this postcards from Windsor, because these are pictures leading up to the Ambassador Bridge. And I recently did a study in collaboration with Statistics Canada where we looked at a huge number of records of trucking shipments and the economics of trucking. And what we found is that when you move something across the border, it costs about 15 to 40% more than if you move the same goods the same distance domestically. Okay? So crossing the border is very expensive in a number of ways, certainly in the case of freight. So why should we care about this? Well, I won't give you my whole regular little sermon on this issue tonight, but I'll invite you to look at a report called Border and the Ontario Economy that you can download free from a website that I'll give you at the end, that basically makes the case that the Ontario economy depends very much on the Canada-US border. If Ontario were a separate country, it would be one of the most trade-dependent countries in the world, and consequently movements across the border are necessary for our prosperity. So in light of this, we're doing a lot of research at the University of Windsor on the border. Now, one of the things that's affected the border was the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Those attacks resulted in greater scrutiny at the border, a greater emphasis placed on the danger of terrorists crossing the border, especially on the U.S. side. And so what we've done is research that tries to look at, how much difference does that make? Has it had a big impact? these are results of a study. It's kind of hard to explain it very quickly, but what we see here is the number of Canadians that cross into the United States on a daily basis in different years from 1972 to 2011. And you see it's actually come down by a great deal. And by using multivariate statistics to make the relationship between these crossings and all of the factors such as exchange rates, the state of the economy, and the events of September 11th, we're able to do a kind of a counterfactual exercise where if you look at that dotted line that goes up, that's what our model is basically telling we would have expected to see in terms of Canadians crossing the border if September 11th hadn't taken place. And so basically by doing that sort of analysis, we're making the case that we more or less cut travel across the border in half as a result of those events. I'm going to skip through this because I want to get onto this point here. Now, what we have done at the University of Windsor has a new strategic research plan in which we have defined border research as one of the 4 great challenges that we're addressing at the University of Windsor. And this is just a list of all the different topics that are being studied about the U.S.-Canada border by people in all the different faculties in the university, law, engineering, science, etc. And then I just want to make a final point, which is to say all of this research, we put a great deal of emphasis on trying to use this research practically, in a practical way, bring this research to the public. This is just a flyer from an event that took place last Saturday morning, where we invited people from the public, mostly people that represented small and medium-sized entrepreneurial firms who had trouble getting their stuff across the border. So we brought them in. We used some of our researchers from the law school. We brought in an industry expert, and basically taking this research that we're doing, because really our goal at the University of Windsor is not just to understand the border, but to bring that information that we get about the border and pass it on to the people in our region. So I'll leave you with a word from our sponsors and contact information.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. All right, question for the audience. Who here is currently getting older? Only a couple of you. The rest of you are doing really well. Okay, for those few people who admit to getting older currently, how many of you would like to maintain your mobility as you age? Okay, a few more hands, like I suspected. That means you'll probably be interested in Stephen Perry's research. Stephen studies kinesiology, that's the study of human movement, at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. In particular, Stephen focuses on what happens to our bodies as we age and what we can do when our bodies age to stay mobile. It won't surprise you then to hear him and his argument about what matters now is how we can maintain mobility into old age. Stephen. Hopefully the clicker will work this time. I've got it there for you.
Okay, thank you, Pia. So I'll start off giving you a little bit of a reason why we do this type of research, and the main reason is the aging population. So as we move into the in years, basically our population is getting older. So as the baby boomers start to transition through the population, everybody hears that the population, 60 plus, is going to get larger. But as you see in the very last part of this slide, is that our population is now becoming more evenly distributed, meaning that people who are younger, people who are older, all seem to contain the same population or percentage of our population throughout. So we're going to have a continuous plan of how to actually manage these older adults. And one of the ways is to provide preventative measures rather than treating the events after they happen. So that's what most of my research is about, prevention. And prevention of falls. Okay, so in order for a fall to occur, you have to have what's called a balance disturbance. And so those include oh, I just gave away the secret there. So So it's kind of a simplified equation. So you have to have a balanced disturbance, which is a slip or trip or something that pushes you out of your comfort zone. But younger people experience this every day as well. And so they experience probably more than older adults, actually, because they experience more diverse activities. So it's the inability to recover this balance that is the real problem. Sensing when you're losing your balance, and also producing reactive forces to keep your balance. Now, some interesting facts are that unintentional injuries due to falls is the 5th leading cause for hospitalization behind cancer in age group of 65 and over. Every 10 minutes, a senior will be appear in an emergency room, and every 30 minutes, a senior will be admitted to the hospital because of a fall, specifically because of a fall. Okay. So most researchers previously have looked at when we're just standing, so how we actually manage balance when we're standing. So here illustrates, so the center of mass, which is the COM acronym here, and BOS stands for the base of support, which is your structure, the feet, which interacts with the environment. And so standing is a non-threatening event, and most of the balance research is when we're standing. However, in our lab, we look at actually perturbations or balance disturbance during walking. So when we actually perturb ourselves, so every time we take a step, we're actually perturbing ourselves, moving our center of mass out of our base of support, and then we have to recover. And so this involves a lot of integration of very complex activities. And so that's what this comes up. So I'm not going to explain everything that's in this chart because it can get very involved. But it's three very simple components. So center of mass represents the body motion. The base of support represents any contact with our environment where we can produce reactive forces that'll maintain our balance. And so we monitor both of those with our sensory system, vision, vestibular, somatosensory, which is touch primarily, and joint sense. That is all fed into the central nervous system, and then it's fed to the mechanical system, which is the joints, which are the levers that allow our muscles to provide reactions. And so this is a continuous cycle, and we perform this cycle all of the time. So any part of this cycle is interrupted, causes a problem. And so most of the problems occur sensory and central nervous system, because the musculoskeletal system has actually been shown that we do have enough capacity to actually respond to balance disturbance even as we get within our 80s and 90s. So at this point, I'm going to ask you a question. So if I can get my question up on the board. Okay, so I'm going to ask you what body sense is most important for us to keep our balance. Okay, so vision, vestibular, which is within our inner ear, and so that's our vestibular organ, touch, or hearing. Okay, so if everybody's voted, the result might be somewhat surprising. To me it is, but to you it may not be surprising. So the inner ear, everybody thinks the vestibular system is the actual, is the component. So in my opinion, it's actually not the vestibular system. So if we switch back to my slides, I think it's the foot. So it's actually the what's termed the plantar cutaneous sensation from the bottom of the foot. And so if you think of it, the only direct connection between us and our environment are our feet. The vestibular system is located at the central nervous system, very far away from the muscles that we actually have to activate to recover our balance. And so in order for us to recover our balance, we need to activate muscles within 35 to 60 milliseconds, which basically if an impulse travels from the brain, where the vestibular system is, all the way down to the lower leg muscles, it's not going to recover our balance. So you need something that is much quicker. And there's been proof that there's actually a connection between the bottom of our feet and the muscles that are required to maintain our balance at the rate of about 35 to 50 milliseconds. Okay, so what is the solution? So actually, as we age, we lose this sensation from the bottom of the feet. We reach a peak at 21 years of age, and all of a sudden we start to decline, okay? So we lose the sensation, and an older adult at the age of 60 is about 3 times as insensitive as a young adult, but we don't notice it. And so so the foot has 2 roles, sensation and mechanical. And to solve the sensation, my research is actually an insole that actually provides facilitation or enhancement of the sensory information. And it's designed at the perimeter of the foot to give you both information of where the base of support is and where the center of mass is moving. So it's called the Balance Pro. It is commercially available. And then we're now advancing to footwear and how you actually translate muscle activity into forces that actually keep your balance. So we're designing one that optimizes that system. So just to end, I just want to acknowledge all of the funding support and so forth, and specifically Diane, Adam, Nathan, and Madeline. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next speaker studies things that will probably give some of you the creepy crawlies, myself as well. Infectious diseases, parasites, bugs, and worms. Pardon me. Stuff is not always pretty, but if all it does is kind of gross you out, give you the heebie-jeebies, you're doing pretty good. Because for many people around the world, parasites, bugs, worms give them much more than the heebie-jeebies, much more than the ick factor. They're about life and death. Anna Sanchez is based at Brock University in St. Catharines, and she studies diseases that affect people all across the globe. Before Anna comes up, I'm just going to ask her question on her behalf. So let's put up the slide that Anna wants everyone to vote on. Her question is, how much money per year does a small country like Honduras lose due to problems associated with deficient sanitation and tropical diseases? If you think it's about $8 million, which is about $1 per person who lives in Honduras, that's A. About $40 million, $5 per inhabitant, B. Almost $300 million, C. And between $50 and $100 million, and you can click on D. I'm going to invite Anna up to the stage to discuss the answers with you, as she argues what matters now is nothing short of eradicating infectious diseases.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. So what matters now for me is can we switch back into my presentation? I want to make a case for infectious diseases. Specifically, I want to make a case that what matters now is controlling a group of diseases that are collectively known as tropical neglected diseases that are affecting more than 1 billion people today. So 1 billion people, that's a lot of people. And how come this is not on the news all the time? And the answer to that is that these diseases are so pervasive and so common that they seldom make the news. In fact, if you see on the map, climate, poverty, and lack of sanitation interlap, and that's where infectious diseases prevail. 1/3 of the world population is at risk of acquiring one of these infections. But the risk is so high that 1 in 6 people on this planet is already infected with one of at least 17 tropical diseases that are called neglected tropical diseases. What this map is not showing you is that these diseases and poverty actually have a vicious circle. One feeds the other, one drives the other, and one makes the other one worse. Wherever you see inadequate sanitation, inadequate water, and lack of services, you will see these diseases. But when these diseases exist, you will see that there is more malnutrition, more stigma, and more social problems. So this is a vicious circle that we would like to cut. Specifically, I would like to mention today a group of 7 diseases that are among this group that are particularly important in children. Even though these diseases don't kill, they undermine children's health gravely. They cause anemia, they cause lack of loss of weight, they don't sleep well, good enough, they have poor grades, they don't even respond to regular immunizations of childhood immunizations properly because of their immune system is also depleted. Many of these diseases are caused by parasites that live in the intestines. And because there's lack of sanitation and no toilets, then children are forced to contaminate their environments from which the parasites will get into the next person. So toilets, as you think about it, and last week was the World Toilet Day, and I tweeted about, with a picture of my toilet. It's a pretty nice toilet, so I thought it could, personal information out there. But toilets are pretty neat for our health. They are instrumental for our well-being. But another thing that is cool about toilets is that it's their best kept secret for economic prosperity. If we see on this map, and the World Bank put this map last week for World Toilet Day, and it tells us that countries lose at least 1.5% of the gross domestic product due to problems associated to disease, lack of sanitation, diarrheas, and many other diseases. Closer to home, you will see here that in Latin America, 21% of the population is living under these conditions. Of course, it's just an average because there are communities where this is far worse. So our question to you was, how much do you think Honduras is losing due to these problems? Honduras' GDP is about $18.3 billion per year. So Honduras is losing almost $300 million that it doesn't have because of these problems. It's a very small country with a lot of problems, not enough money, and then we are wasting money due to these problems. So why is this happening, and why are not we taking more action? The answer to that question would be on the name, on the word neglect. Neglected diseases, but not as much as the diseases, but the populations that are suffering from them. The poor, most of the time, are invisible to their own governments. They're not a priority. And even if they are, there are so many other priorities that are more pressing. And if these diseases are not killing children and not killing pregnant women, they have to put their resources on something else. So, of course, we have grown to believe that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But as what I expressed before, these are not really making children stronger. On the contrary. We need then to get this message across. We need to have powerful stories that will move people, that will move governments and the media to believe that we need to put some actions into these problems. But at the same time, and at the end of the day, everybody wants data. Everybody wants research data that is going to show us how exactly are we losing this money and where is it that we can take action. So my latest research in Honduras, my native country, shows 2 very powerful and neat findings. Here we see that the Human Development Index, as is measured by the United Nations, a little bit increase in the Human Development Index, we see that children have fewer worms. On the flip side of that, children living in the same exact community under the same circumstances, the more worms they have, the less they grow. We see here on the other side that the growth indicators, their height, their body mass index, and their weight for age and gender are all lower because of these parasites. So this is where Honduras is losing a lot of its money that doesn't have a lot of. So is there anything that we can do about it? And the answer is, of course, we have solutions. There is treatment, of course. There is deworming treatment that we can use. It only costs 50 cents per child per year. Of course, we need to deploy this, and resources are a lot more expensive, but there's hope. Of course, we need also a long-term plan that is going to help us maintain in a sustainable way this decrease in parasitic diseases and increasing water, sanitation and hygiene is, of course, important. But my job today is also tell you that research on these diseases is important because we need vaccines, we need better drugs, we need to monitor what we're doing, not just to say this is where we are at this moment. We need to say this is where we can go and this is the plans that we can work around because we have research to show. So I'm going to leave you today or tonight with this picture of a Honduran schoolgirl blowing kisses to you. So you can ponder why it's so important to do more research and action in neglect tropical diseases. So we have children without worms, so we have children with better nutrition and better futures in general. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. As we've already seen tonight, that sort of stereotypical image of a university researcher being in a lab coat, in a lab, and Bunsen burners, it's not really true. Most of our researchers that we hear in this series do not use Bunsen burners. They study many different kinds of things. Lauren Dawson, who's our next speaker, he studies sociology of religion at the University of Waterloo. His latest book is called The Sociology of Religion, A Canadian Perspective. It came out in October. Sold at bookstores. Good Christmas present. In this day and age, if you mention society and religion, the same sentence, the conversation undoubtedly often will turn to terrorism. And Lauren himself has been drawn into this conversation, has become one of the world's leading experts on what factors can turn someone towards violence and terror. Tonight, Lauren is going to be asking the question and answering the question that I think many more people ask now, more than ever before, and that question is, how much of a threat are Canadian terrorists? Lauren.
Thank you, Pia. I think we've had some really interesting presentations tonight. I was a little worried coming up last that some of the audience may have drifted off. I doubt that's the case because it's really been intriguing and material that everyone has presented. So let's try and round it out with something else rather fascinating and interesting. There is an audience question that I had posed for people, so we'll put it up there. So how many Canadians do you think CSIS, that's the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, investigated in 2010 as possible terrorists? So A is 20, B is 40, C is 200, D 1,000. So while you're answering that, I'll add some information here. We're not talking about people who just vaguely may be involved in some kind of terrorist activity. This is from a report from CSIS to the Canadian Parliament, and we're talking individuals who in the determination of CSIS had already engaged in actions that violated the Terrorism Act of Canada, specific clauses of the Terrorism Act of Canada. So there's actually a wider circle of people who could be more implicitly involved in these kinds of activities. We see a well-informed audience then. The correct answer is C, 200. So I see many people did get that answer. Okay, so we'll get into the presentation here. And I'm going to have the same issues I can see probably with it. Oops, I hope it stays there. Okay, so what I study specifically is homegrown terrorist radicalization. So these terms have been kicking around in the media for quite a little while now. But just to quickly define that, I'm really a scholar studying radicalization. That is the word used to describe the process of becoming a terrorist. So homegrown is just a term that has kicked up in the last 6 or 7 years to describe people within societies turning on their own fellow citizens. Essentially, it's just domestic terrorism. But post 9/11, the focus was extensively on Al-Qaeda and on international forms of terrorism and on a threat coming from outside the country. After some events that have happened, of course, like this, the London bombing, and other events in Europe, like the bombings on the trains in Madrid, focus started to turn to people within the country themselves becoming radicalized. Now I'm going to go back because, of course, there's a local connection here. Hopefully, yeah. You may recognize these two individuals. So these are two individuals from here in London who have been involved in terrorist activity. Now, I have to mention Khurram Shear, who was arrested here on a terrorist activity in 2010, is still, his trial is still ongoing. So he is merely accused. He's not convicted in any way. But he was a pathologist working at the hospital in St. Thomas. He's a Canadian born in Canada, father with children, well integrated in the community with a medical degree from McGill. And then you may recognize the picture of Christos Casarubas, who's one of two individuals from this community that traveled to Africa, became involved in an Al-Qaeda affiliated group, and died in the terrorist attack on a natural gas plant in Algeria in January of this year. Now, this is really where I'm focused as a sociologist. What do I think we need to know? Well, if we're going to understand the how, we need to understand who is involved in this terrorist activity, how they become involved in this terrorist activity, and of course the million-dollar question is, why did they become involved in this activity? After 9/11, there was a massive surge of interest in terrorism and a great surge in scholarly activity, but a very limited and fragmentary quality. And there was a tremendous impetus to jump too quickly to answering the why question without properly understanding the how questions. Now scholarship is reorienting back to understanding in more detailed and specific ways how people became radicalized or do become radicalized. As a sociologist, I want to establish the linkage between these items. It's not, you need all of them. You need to understand individual motivations, but you need to understand them in light of social structural conditions. You also need to understand group dynamics, small group dynamics, social psychological factors, and it's all the contribution of all of these elements to fashioning an alternative conception of reality, constructing an alternate reality that these individuals live in, a reality which allows them quite serenely to believe that acts that we see are horrendous are in fact morally justified. Because these individuals do believe they are acting not criminally, they believe they are acting with great moral justification. And we have the delay in the slides. Okay, I'm going to just quickly pass this. It's an enormously difficult area for research. It's enormously difficult because of the tremendous diversity of kinds of terrorism and terrorist organizations, and because of the tremendous diversity of the kinds of people involved in terrorism, including even within any single organization. We have a huge problem of primary data because, as you can imagine, talking to terrorists is not something that's done readily. However, surprisingly, there is a considerable amount of data starting to build. The other problem is there are vast amounts of data available, secret data that governments control. But scholars are forced to work with publicly available data, which is quite limited. It all leads to something called the explanatory gap. At this stage, we have many factors involved that we can talk about, but not enough to explain why a few individuals actually engage in terrorist activity. And I can see I'm way behind on time here now. So I want to stress, we're not dealing with something that exclusively is about Salafi jihadist terrorism, right? Terrorism comes in many forms. Recently, there's some other episodes. We're talking about literally hundreds of plots over the last decade. This is the 4 main Canadian episodes, plots that have been activated concern about these issues in Canada. And the key to things is what's called the problem of radicalization. If you ask a terrorist why he's engaged in an action, he's engaged in an action because he has certain grievances or she has certain grievances. That grievances leads to social action, and it leads some individuals to engage in violence. The problem is we all know that the number of people that engage in violence is so small relative to the number of people that hold the grievances. The mere stipulation of the grievances does not explain why they engage in the violent action. Secondly, we have the problem in the case of homegrown terrorism. We have individuals that have not been subject to the kinds of trauma, personal or collective, that explain acts of terrorism in other contexts, like Chechen Republic, Sri Lanka, the civil wars in Sri Lanka, or the Palestinian situation. So why do some young men from suburban Canadian cities become involved in this activity? Now, I wanted to explode a few myths here. I'm going to do it very quickly, and that is, first of all, what do we know? Well, we do know that, contrary to people's popular conceptions, terrorists are not crazy. There is no statistical evidence of psychopathology. The social profile of terrorists is, as the New York City Police Department says, remarkably ordinary. Crimogenic factors that normally explain youthful delinquency do not apply to most of the individuals involved in terrorism. They are largely, 83% or so, they are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. They're overwhelmingly male and they are very young. There are exceptions to all of these things, but those are the most prominent things we know. Now I'm just going to flash the next to last slide, but the last one that really counts. This is one that maybe in Q&A we can get back to. Because what we need is a very large, comprehensive, multifactorial model that can get at explaining why, to overcome the explanatory gap and explain why some individuals become involved in terrorism. Picture this as a funnel. We're starting with factors that affect an enormous number of people, and we're working our way down with each set of factors that we look at to a smaller and smaller number of people that are impacted. You need all of these variables to be involved to come to an explanation. This involves information from a vast variety of disciplines and fields of research. So it's very complex. I was hoping to be able to get a chance to talk to a few of these variables, but I think I'm going to have to move to the very last slide, just a few concluding words, which is, okay, so in the end, what's the bottom line? This is a standard phrase used in terrorism studies. In Canada, the prospect of a terrorist act is very low probability, but we all recognize its extremely high impact. And all I need to say is that if the Toronto 18 had actually been able to set off their bombs, our entire conversation about terrorism in Canada would be dramatically different. It would be more like the conversation in the United Kingdom after the London bombings. It's a new permanent reality, whether we like it or not, because if I go through that model, we can demonstrate that almost all the pertinent factors are here to stay, and under late modern conditions, they're probably going to become more egregious. So this is a reality we have to deal with. The key is how to manage it and how to avoid the costs of developing an overly securitized response, because we do not want to sacrifice our civil liberties in order to secure our safety. Thank you very much.
I'm going to get, Lauren's going to have a seat, and I'm going to ask the other four researchers to come have a chair here. And if we can get the podium just moved over a little bit while they're coming up. We're going to open up for questions from the audience. While these guys are getting up here and getting mic'd, there's been a lot of talk today, if you've been listening to the news, about hockey. NHL deal struck with Rogers. My colleagues at CBC having a hard day today. We're giving away a hockey jersey. It is not from the NHL, though. It is from Research Matters. Dom has it there. Let's show it off. Pretty nice. So you all dropped a business card of your name into, I think, a draw at the beginning. And we pulled a name for the winner of the jersey. It is Rain Hatinga. Rain, you there? Come on up. Grab your jersey. There you go. We all going to fit up here? I'll just get you mic'd up. It is now a chance for you guys to ask questions. There's a mic in the center of the room there. You can come up and ask a question of one of the researchers in particular, of all five of them. As well, we'll ask people watching on the webcast to pose their question as well. Hashtag, of course, is what matters now. What matters now. If you're watching it on webcast, you can send that via Twitter. So anyone have a question, you can start heading up to the mic. And as we get, Bill's sitting in front of a podium. That's not very good. We're going to move this, Bill. Why don't we probably get rid of the podium, eh?
We could, actually.
Right? Can we put it on the floor?
Sure. Yeah.
Can we do that? We need this. We're going to need this again at the end.
Well, okay.
Right?
So you're going to leave this
Yeah. Okay, sure. So we're going to leave this? Because we're going to need it at the end. Okay? Yeah, sure. Just get everyone plugged in. We're just getting the last few. All right. Everyone mic'd up here, Caleb? Just about? All right. I want to... Oh. Lauren, you're not mic'd because you went over time. They're not going to give you... All right. Okay, so I'm going to ask the first question of you five, and I'll pose it sort of generally, and maybe we can start the conversation with that. As you all spoke tonight, we were talking about what matters now, and you're all presently doing this research, but they all have long-term goals. They're not going to be solved, these mysteries, overnight. So how strange is it for you to focus on the immediacy of that question, what matters now? Why don't you start us off there, Jody?
I think it's, of course, we always want to think about the long-term impacts of our research, but they're often extremely hard to predict. And so one example that I use is with magnetic resonance imaging, for example. That was developed initially just from curiosity, and people had no idea when the fundamental steps to developing MRI came about, that it would actually be used to diagnose diseases and disorders and so on, and it just came out of that. And so I think it's a useful exercise to predict where things are going to go, but it's often very hard to do. And I know in our own work it's a challenge to think about all of the possibilities, and there's probably a lot that we're missing.
And Anna, what about for you? Because the area that you study, I mean, it's not a new problem. In many ways, I wouldn't say that Lawrence is a new problem, but there's more focus on it now. So how hard is it for you to sort of talk about the immediacy and why this matters right now, November 26, 2013, as opposed to, down the line, further down the line?
Oh, because it's contextual. Everything is connected. You're correct, ancient diseases, but their impact, for example, on the ability to respond to vaccines is impaired. We are always looking for an HIV vaccine, and there's research evidence to show that people and children with parasites have impaired immunity when they respond to tuberculosis or to HIV/AIDS. So I can see that getting rid of parasites has a future potential in the lifetime of that person.
Stephen, you showed in your graphics there, we're all aging, the percentage of our population getting older is growing. We're going to face, I think the slide you put up was 2030, we're still, 17 years away from 2030. The immediate impact, how do you convince people that it matters today?
The cost today is so large. So within Canada, it's $2 to $4 billion in healthcare due to falls, and that can escalate. And so the only way to manage that, because we're not affording it now, we have to now prevent people from falling. That's the main thing. So.
Bill, you want to pick up on how you convince people immediately that they need to care about the border more today than they did yesterday?
Actually, I don't have that much trouble convincing them that. I think that, in research activities, one of the things you need to do is seek out those people that are dealing with those difficulties today and find out the problems from them, and then see if you can come up with solutions for the moment and not some pie-in-the-sky idea for the future.
Why do you think you have no troubles convincing people? Not you, but why do you think people glom on and really are pulled towards your research?
Well, because there are thousands of firms in Ontario that are struggling with this every day. There are thousands of people that cross the border on a regular basis that are frustrated. So it's actually the type of research topic where people I don't know walk up to me in the street and say, I saw your picture and I want to tell you the story of the problem I'm having with the border. So in a sense, it matters now to people.
Lauren, you were talking about, pre 9/11, there was a smaller body of research in the areas that you look at. And now, as we get further away from 9/11, do you see us having this conversation, about terrorism as rich as it is in the last 10 years moving forward, or do you see that sort of diminishing?
Well, I can see it petering out a little bit, but regrettably, I really believe that probably more incidents are coming, more episodes. The focus may change, but the basic conditions driving certain young people to seek to engage in these kinds of actions are, as I indicated, staying the same. And in terms of it being a matter for now, I'm dealing in a context constantly where government organizations are under tremendous pressure to come up with solutions now. So they're busy trying to do counterterrorism, and they're trying to do de-radicalization. The problem I have as a scholar and my colleagues is convincing them that garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have an adequately rich understanding of what radicalization is to begin with, all of your attempts at de-radicalization are going to be, they'll fail. They'll be inadequate. So, but there's tremendous pressure for constantly a kind of now on this topic. What we really need is time to say, let's pause and think about this in a more serious, slow, long-term framework.
That's a dangerous proposition, though, when we're talking about terrorism. When you say, wait, we got to take this slowly, when we're trying to fight this, is that part of the challenge for you, that people are like, no, we need this fixed today. We don't want, obviously.
It happens constantly. I'm co-director of something called the Canadian Research Network, Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. So we're a national body. And we run workshops in Ottawa and elsewhere all the time. The workshops involve people from the community, from NGOs, government departments, 7 different ministries, and academics. And every time we run one of these workshops, the government partners are pushing a new agenda. They're pushing a new agenda that suits some kind of immediate political need on their part before we've even gotten around to really dealing with the questions that rose in the previous workshop. So, in a funny way, we're constantly trying to put the brakes on, but get them to recognize you too believe this is a long-term problem. That's one thing that governments in the pre-9/11 era, governments believed that terrorism was something that was periodic, would arise on certain issues, then disappear, and you could deal with it on a kind of contingency basis. Now there's the recognition that no, this is the way things have changed. One little thing, if I'm going to arbitrarily pick something, the internet has guaranteed that terrorism is now going to be a permanent feature in the future.
Anyone from the audience have a question? You want to make your way up to the microphone just so we can hear? You don't want to. She's cringing. You know what? It's for our webcast, so why we want you to. Do you want to grab my mic? Okay. Here.
Hi. I'm just wondering if there is a generally accepted objective definition of terrorism, and if it's always been historically perpetrated by young people like you said it is now.
There is no accepted definition of terrorism. There are thousands of pages written on what is terrorism. There is a famous article from a guy named Alex Schmidt, written about 15 years ago, at which point he delineated something like 283 different circulating definitions of terrorism. There are all the official definitions of terrorism for legal purposes, FBI versus the Canadian government, and most of them are totally adequate for our purposes. The key problem, of course, is the relativity of terrorism. I mean, it's an old sop, but absolutely true. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And that issue you always have to be extremely aware and sensitive about. Is terrorism a tactic? What is it, right? You get different concerns on that issue. The youthful element is youth for various reasons. I don't want to take up too much time. There are various obvious reasons why youth predominate in terrorism and why it's a youthful activity. Some of it's just practical, but I'll just mention one thing. There's a major study coming out of the United States right now, funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, that's going to involve researchers in about 15 to 20 different nations on radicalization. They chose as the title of this large project, Quest for Significance. So when I'm talking to a very general audience, I ask them to really seriously sit down and realize that young men in particular, not all young men, but many young men have a fundamental desire to matter, to make a difference, to have an impact, to be significant. They also may be in circumstances where they cannot do that in a conventional manner. So under a set of circumstances, they choose to become significant by engaging in these very violent actions. We have a set of cultural conditions that are allowing that to happen with much greater ease than ever before in the history of human society.
Anyone else in the audience have a question? From Twitter? Patchen's coming up to read that one.
Sorry about this. Yeah, so I've been monitoring Twitter. So I've got a question for Stephen, which is, can you talk about where it is possible to get a sense-enhancing insole? Where it's possible to get a sense-enhancing insole? Someone's asking on behalf of their grandparents.
Okay.
But I'd like to answer.
The Balance Pro is commercially available, and so it's called Balance Pro, and it's sold at balancepro.ca. So it's commercialized. It's been commercialized through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and so it's a company that I am engaged in, but it's for sale. So.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You can, yeah. Or maybe give me the mic.
So I have a question for you, Stephen, too. So minor little background. So I have a 93-year-old mother who, of course, is in long-term care. She was absolutely, totally independent, healthy, bright, sharp. She has no dementia till she was 90 years old, and she missed a curb, right, and ruptured her Achilles tendon. Now she's permanently in a wheelchair, right? Now, from your research, it strikes me, in addition to having the insert, et cetera, in the shoe, there must be ways in which people could be trained, right? Your evidence suggests there are ways in which we could be taking all of us as we grow older and train us how to better understand the messages coming from our feet and how to move and avoid these things. I know rehabs or physiotherapists do all this all the time, but you seem to have more specific insight.
So basically, you're correct. Yes, Lauren. There are ways to train, and we actually go into long-term care facilities and train people to actually respond to perturbations. And so we train them, we give them gentle pushes, and they do what is called a compensatory step. And so compensatory step takes all the sensory information, and so you need to experience the balance disturbances multiple times in order to train the central nervous system of how to react to it. And so we can improve their reaction times, we can improve the way that they move, and the muscles that they need to use. So the flexibility, we also use Tai Chi and compensatory stepping training to actually train these older adults. And their quality of life improves. And so with the addition of the sensory enhancement, and we also do the research in footwear, and so we try to optimize the footwear, and that all brings together what's called the neuromechanical, so the sensory and mechanics of the foot. So how you sense the environment and how you actually output information out into the environment. So it all comes together. So the training, the footwear, sensory facilitation all comes together. So I think that comes into Jody's area where you're looking at different functional MRI. I also work in functional MRI a little bit, but not as vastly. But maybe Jody can talk to us about somatosensory cortex, because that's really important when you're talking about grasping objects and so forth. So.
And certainly, yeah, in our field of MRI, there's lots of studies of the various senses and things like sensory integration. Some senses are easier to study than others, and one of the big problems we have, as you know, with things like functional MRI is that you can't have people walking about. They've got to be lying flat, so it would be great to be able to look at things like the ability to sense the foot pressure and compensate for your balance. But we do have some restrictions in terms of having people lying flat on their backs and what we can do.
Patchen's still at the mic. I'm hovering.
I'll read it the way it is first, and then so it's aimed at Bill, Anna, and Lauren. It's a question about connectivity. So can connectivity lower terror risk, and does it contribute to maybe better fighting infectious diseases and help build economies that way? So I guess it's a question about how you apply connectivity to your areas of study as well.
Bill, why don't you start?
Well, in terms of the sort of straightforward movement of people and goods, all of those things will tend to increase the danger of things like the spread of infectious diseases. I think connectivity, which involves the transfer of information, the transfer of technology, obviously can have a benefit in terms of addressing some of these issues at their root causes. So I think when we think about connectivity, I think we need to think about it in terms of not just the movement of goods, but also the movement of information, and how information that might flow back from those areas where infected people, for example, are coming, being found at airports and things like that, flowing back information to try to address these types of questions might have a benefit. But in the short run, the basic answer is these are costs, I think, that are associated with a very high level of connectivity in the world. I don't know whether.
Yeah, I think that prion diseases, mad cow disease, one cow infected here in Canada, all of the borders shut down for meat export. So all of this research in infectious disease and eradication, particularly the ones that are affecting us economically, the links, we can't even think about the links right now. Only later we are looking at these diseases being involved in Alzheimer's, for example. So the more we research down the road, we find all that things are connected. And as you say, information sharing is the best thing that could have happened, because now we have everybody's ideas connected, and I think that we can evolve knowledge a lot faster.
You might say a more positive way of trying to approach the danger of infectious diseases affecting us is, rather than trying to keep people from other countries out, is to try to attack those infectious diseases in other countries through the transfer of information and technology.
Or do you want to pick up on the Twitter question there?
Yeah, so connectivity is pretty much at the heart of everything dealing with terrorism and the process of radicalization, especially if we're talking homegrown terrorist radicalization. Just let's make it concrete. So if we go to the single largest episode in Canada, the Toronto 18, we're dealing with, as I alluded to, young men from Scarborough, Mississauga, none of which had traveled outside the country to war zones or to take training somewhere outside the country. None of them had any personal experience from their background of being in a traumatic situation. We talk about a vicarious traumatization. They reached a point where they were so morally outraged by what was happening to their Muslim brothers and sisters elsewhere in the world that they bonded together and through their connectivity started to plot activity. But all of that was done through the mechanism of the internet, right? All of that was done through downloading materials from the internet, chatting with people on the internet, forming the whole consciousness of their activity was all done via the internet and the connectivity. And the better that connectivity gets, the easier and better that all of this can be done. And the more enlightened and aware young people are about how to use this technology, the better and easier it can be done. But of course, it's that very connectivity that is the Achilles heel too, because that is how authorities track and secure these people. So, there's that old cartoon that, shows a dog playing on the internet, right? And, the dog saying they think I'm a human being, right? You never know what's on the other end. And of course, nowadays, the odds are if somebody wants to talk to you about jihad, it's very likely an FBI agent or something of that nature, right? So connectivity and constantly playing with and modifying the connectivity is really at the core of all of it. And there's tremendous transfer of information and a tremendous transformation of consciousness as a result of that.
As you do your research, there are a lot of spurious conclusions that people make. They connect dots that perhaps don't exist. How conscientious are you to what people say? Well, it's obviously this group of people, or it comes from this. How conscientious are you? How conscientious are you when you're doing your research?
Yeah, that's why I want to be very careful. My background and why I got involved in this is I'm a sociologist of religion, but I had done work on religion and violence in general. So first and obvious thing is there's a vast literature about how every conceivable kind of religion you can think of has in some way facilitated or promoted violence at some point or other. So to indicate that, of course, that this is a problem with Islam is a gross distortion. We all know this, but it warrants being repeated over and over again. We're talking about a tiny, small number of people who, yes, see themselves as Muslims, and they see themselves, according to the jihadi narrative, really promoted by Al-Qaeda, as defending Islam against its enemies. But they are working with a very specific interpretation and reading of Islam. So we always use a phrase like Salafi jihadists, which is referring to a specific worldview, and not even just Salafism. Salafism just means people who are trying to follow the practices of the ancients, of those who were the companions of Muhammad. But more importantly, jihad, because jihad is a very specific modern interpretation of even a Salafi orientation, with this focus on the need to actually engage in physical conflict with the enemies of Islam in order to defend Islam. So there's all of that. But I purposely put those slides up there because, of course, one of the most horrific acts of terrorism in recent years is actually Breivik, right? Anders Breivik in Norway, who, of course, is working from a right-wing European conception, and he's anti-Islamic. And he went out and, of course, he planted the bomb that killed about 7 individuals in Oslo, then proceeded to the island and shot another 69 young people. Going into the details of every one of these cases is absolutely fascinating, and you can't just drop it at the doorstep of any religious tradition. You have to do this multifactorial analysis. Religion does have a role to play, but very specific forms of religiosity.
Question at the mic there.
Hi. I grew up in Windsor and moved to London about 20 years ago and through, obviously, the 9/11. And I guess this question is for Bill, but has your research done anything on the movement of goods, services, and or the delays at the border for terrorism and what we're facing every day now?
Well, you know, the truth of the matter is that you know, there isn't much evidence of terrorist activities crossing the borders in terms of especially the movement of goods. It's not so much that you know, if you ask officials from say the Department of Homeland Security to give you examples of how the enhanced scrutiny that we have at the border has paid off, they give you drug examples. They give you examples of how they've captured drugs, how they've captured money being laundered. If it's coming the other direction, they're probably going to talk about capturing firearms that you know, might end up in the hands of gang members, but not really terrorists. And so in some way, the focus on terrorism and the border, it's an interesting history because it led to making the border a much more stringent place in terms of the scrutiny that's placed on every person and every cargo load that goes across the border. And yet the outcomes of it have been to tackle a lot of serious crimes, but they're not really terrorism.
We have any other questions from the audience? One more. Do you mind just go, or 2 more? Do you guys mind just going up to the microphone, please?
Yeah, I have a question, actually a couple, but first I'll ask one. Do you think it is connected a little bit to how Western society and white people in particular and their attitudes, how they feel towards, and for centuries, you know, just the history of colonization and, you know, discrimination and, you know, and enslaving people who are now called, you know, the citizens of the third world countries, right? And do you think that this aspect, historical, is connected to the lack of interest and lack of help to those countries now that are infected, you know, with these parasites and dying? Thanks.
Jen, that's a question for Anna. I just want to be clear. Yeah, and so I just want to be clear about what you're asking her. Can you just ask the question again?
Yeah, I'm just asking whether why do you think and what can be done, you know, to increase the interest and the action to fight, you know, these infectious diseases, and why they're, you know, I understand, you know, it's climate and poverty, right? But and as you touched on that, right? And I think that's very important aspect of why there's still diseases there and why there's lack of sanitary equipment, just even basic one. So do you think it's somehow connected with just the history of discrimination against just a question,
Yeah,
just a
definitely.
personal,
I think that there is a lot of geopolitical history associated with infectious disease and how infectious disease has transferred from one continent to the other. I mean, the Spaniards coming to Mesoamerica, they brought diseases, guns, steel, and germs, if you read Jarrett's book. They also took some with them, for example, syphilis, so kind of like payback. However, there was a time in history where, and still probably, you have to go to England to study tropical diseases, or to Stockholm, like I did, because it's been colonizers' concern about their troops and their soldiers not dying, or the Panama Canal, if you think about it, how we succeeded after dying with yellow fever and malaria. The French couldn't do it, so the Americans had to take over. So there's a lot of geopolitical aspects to infectious disease. And once we thought that we had antibiotics and hygiene was on the way and industrialized nations had a better future, then it became something that didn't interest Western societies, particularly industrialized countries, as you say, much. So countries that were before the source of riches then became abandoned because they were not rich anymore or whatever happened. So those diseases flourished there. And at the point where industrialized nations got on with their sanitation movements and reforms, these other countries were still dealing. And we can see that many countries are 100 years behind in sanitation and all of this. The good news is that that is changing. And I think globalization has something good about globalization, I think, is that connectivity that makes it more real for all of us here sitting today and thinking. And I think that you mentioned, Lauren, low probability, high impact. And with these diseases, it's the other way around, right? Yeah. High probability, low income. And I joke with my students a lot, and I say, darn immigrants, they bring all these diseases to Canada, and they laugh because, of course, I am one immigrant. But there is a lot of that, and so we see that this is low impact. So why do we care? Even though 52 people died of SARS, the economic issues that SARS brought were more than 1 billion people with worms, right? So we live in this world of clashes of interests, and that's where the good news is that more of us are getting involved in issues that are not particularly on our faces every day.
But even Anna, I mean, in your presentation, you've chose to frame it in economic terms. I understand why, right? But isn't it sad that the only way we can make an issue that should be fundamental humanitarian issue something worth doing something about is by looking at the economic costs of it?
But
So,
even
but that's reality.
The World Health Organization wants to know how much money I'm going to save if I give them this tablet. Yeah. You have to present that case, otherwise they don't care. Or they have other issues to care. Go ahead, the microphone.
Hi, good evening. I had a question directed to Dr. Sanchez. In your presentation, you talked about these neglected tropical diseases and how they're chronic. So how would that contrast towards, for example, you talk specifically about the Honduras. Is there a greater impact perhaps on fungal, viral, or bacterial diseases in terms of fatalities in Honduras?
Oh, definitely. The outbreaks of dengue fever, for example, that are more immediate. People died of hemorrhagic fever. That gets a lot of priority. There is malaria. Thankfully, it's not of resistance kind, so we can deal more with that. Honduras and Haiti have the highest prevalence of HIV/AIDS in the Americas, for example. So that is very high up there. So there's many infectious disease issues in Central America that we don't know of. And because Latin America has been more like the US sort of territory in many ways, and now the United States is looking at elsewhere. So Central America it's not on the radar a lot I mean, it's a few million people living there subject to these diseases. Did I answer your question?
Yes,
I feel
yes,
that
you did. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We'll take this last question for the microphone here.
I have a couple of questions. Is that all right?
We'll start.
All right. So my first question is for Stefan. So to what extent have those insoles been studied in people with primary movement disorders like Parkinson's disease?
So there is one publication about Parkinson's disease, and we've actually shown an improvement in. Actually, it was done. The experiment was done here at Western, actually, with one of the physicians, and she looked at. I was a collaborator, and she looked at 20 Parkinson's patients, and the biggest change was that their muscle activity actually returned closer to normal during the walking phase. So rather than pausing, so Parkinson's patients have a frequency of freezing and abnormal muscle activity, then the muscle activity returned more to normal because you have that sensory input that the basal ganglia integrates and so forth. So there's been lots of research done on older adults, and we've shown that it actually, the insole reduces falls about 45% in people who wear the insole for 12 weeks. And so we have done clinical trials, and there has been multiple other research that has shown the importance of the sensation from the bottom of the feet.
Perhaps you can ask one more question, then we can carry on this conversation after the formal part of this evening's over.
This question's for Lauren. So there's the government's always trying to sneak in these little things to increase their surveillance on the people, like, for example, in the cyberbullying law, how they're trying to sneak in the thing about like accessing metadata from the ISPs. My question is, how much of the surveillance and how much of a role does the surveillance play, and the criteria that they use to detect terrorists, how much of that is actually based on actual evidence?
Well, it's sort of a tricky question, especially your latter part, depending on what you mean by actual evidence. So I'll just specify, I'm an expert on radicalization, right? Basically on the human process of how people become terrorists, not so much on security, which I have colleagues that worry about security. But of course, I'm exposed to them and their research, and I do spend quite a bit of time interacting with RCMP, CSIS, Public Safety Canada, et cetera, and Homeland Security. That surveillance is absolutely crucial. And I don't think they would mind me saying, because I've been present when head of counterterrorism in the States and in Canada, high-level officials in relatively public forums have said this, but it doesn't get out into the wider public, that in almost every instance where there's one or two reported or known individuals, there is usually a circle of dozens of other individuals for which they think they have really good evidence to believe that something, larger is afoot, but just not good enough to be able to reach the thresholds for prosecution. So the Toronto 18 involved 18 people arrested, only 11 were ultimately convicted, and people always point to that and say, oh, look, the government massively overreacted. I actually know on good authority, I'm not allowed to tell you how or why, so I'll have to just tell you that in fact there's probably more like 30 or 40 people that really were involved in activity that would worry most Canadians. But the fact that only 11 were convicted shows how good our court system is. We don't readily convict people of these charges. There has to be pretty good and substantial evidence. And we got to remember, in the case of the Toronto 18, most of them pled guilty. So surveillance is the heart. It's actually the only real mechanism we have to prevent a terrorist act.
Thank you to all five of you for this conversation this evening. We began the night with putting up a question that each of them tackled in their presentations. And we got you folks in the audience to vote for it. So let's bring that slide up again and see how everyone at the beginning of the night voted on that. Can we bring that one up? Wait, before we do that, we need you to re-vote first. Sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. If everyone can pick up their, whatever they're called, those little white boxy things.
Clickers.
Clickers, thank you. And if you can vote again now, after hearing the five presentations, which one you think matters now the most. Press A, can we eradicate infectious diseases? B, how much of a threat are Canadian terrorists? C, how do we improve our borderline relationship with the U.S.? D, how does the brain control the body? And E, how can we maintain mobility into old age? So after hearing the 5 presentations, maybe you didn't change your mind, maybe you have, but if you can pick one now, and then we'll compare the two. All right, so let's bring up the beginning of the night. I always have a hard time. Wow.
Gee, nobody changed
Wow,
their mind.
stubborn audience.
Ooh.
No one changed their mind? Exactly. Not one person was convinced. Well, you may have been convinced differently, but someone else swapped with you. So that's very interesting. We have not. I think if we continue this conversation for another hour, that we would probably have people changing their minds and perhaps coming out with the same statistical results, but with people flipping. I want to thank the five researchers that we had here tonight. I think it was a wonderful conversation and just is evidence, speaking of evidence, of the wonderful research that goes on in our Ontario University and the diversity of that research. So if we could just give them a round of applause to thank them for taking the time tonight. Thank you. I also want to thank you for coming out tonight and to invite you to continue the conversation on social media, on our Facebook page, on Twitter, and at your own home bases here in London or wherever you come from. And remind people, your friends and your family, that what happens behind those brick walls at universities does matter to your daily life. We'd also like to invite you to stay for a bit. We're going to have an informal mixer out in the atrium there. So if you want to stick around for a bit, maybe you have some questions that you'd like to ask personally of the researchers, please go ahead. They will stick around for a little bit. And I want to remind you, if you happen to find yourself in Thunder Bay or Toronto and Kingston in the coming months, we will be holding similar events in those 3 cities. And you can go to our website to find out more information. Thank you very much for coming. We'll see you out in the atrium. Thanks, everybody.